A fateful evening at a luxury restaurant in the heart of a bustling American city like Boston or Chicago. Under the warm glow of evening lights, a woman named Grace Thompson walked toward one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, the Crystal Court. Dressed in a cozy sweater and jeans still faintly smudged with paint from her community art class, Grace didn't look like the typical patron of such an upscale venue. But she wasn't there to dine, just to make a reservation for a special occasion, her 15th wedding anniversary. She and her husband, Daniel Thompson, a quiet but brilliant innovator in green tech and co-founder of Solara Technologies, a startup recognized nationally for advancing clean energy solutions, had shared their first date at the Crystal Court. She could still remember the flicker of candlelight bouncing off his eyes, the clink of silverware, and how they had laughed over a shared dessert they couldn't pronounce. Back then, they didn't have much, but in that moment, they had everything. That night became a symbol of their journey together, a humble beginning marked by dreams and sincerity rather than status. Many years ago, tonight, Grace wanted to surprise him by reserving the same table for a celebration next week. When value is judged through appearance, but the moment Grace stepped inside, she was met with immediate skepticism. The atmosphere inside the restaurant was serene and elegant, a stark contrast to the cool indifference that Vanessa, the hostess, exuded as she assessed Grace from head to toe. Her eyes lingered on the paint-speckled jeans and simple cardigan as if they were offensive. "Can I help you?" Vanessa asked, her tone already suggesting the answer would be no. Grace, with a warm smile, explained that she wanted to make a reservation for her and her husband for next Friday, a special evening to celebrate their anniversary at the very place they'd shared their first date. She even noted how important the restaurant was to them, and that she had come in person to express how meaningful the evening would be. Vanessa barely let her finish. "We're fully booked for the next several months," she replied curtly. Grace, undeterred, kindly asked if a deposit or flexibility with time could help secure a table. But Vanessa's expression shifted from neutral to cold, her brows furrowing. "We maintain certain standards here," she said flatly, her voice lower, as if trying not to draw attention to the conversation, but making her message unmistakably clear. The implication hung in the air. Grace didn't look like someone who belonged in a place like this. Her casual clothes, the clay under her fingernails, her presence, it was all deemed unworthy. Not because of behavior or attitude, but because of assumptions drawn solely from her appearance. The warm hospitality Grace had hoped to find was nowhere to be seen. Instead, what greeted her was prejudice dressed up in professionalism. A wealthy regular, Charles Whitman, seated nearby and clad in an obviously tailored suit, overheard the exchange. With a disdainful glance and a sneer, he muttered loud enough for several patrons to hear, "Looks like anyone can walk in here these days." His voice carried the unmistakable arrogance of entitlement, and some diners chuckled politely, unsure whether to laugh or look away. The atmosphere grew tense. Grace, though shaken, kept her composure. She had been judged before, often for choosing purpose over presentation, but this was different. This was meant to belittle. She responded calmly, repeating her request and mentioning how much the place meant to her and her husband. It was at that moment that Monica, the manager, appeared. With quick strides and a disapproving frown, she approached the hostess stand. "Is there a problem here?" she asked sharply, her eyes fixed on Grace. Yes, Vanessa responded, before Grace could speak. This woman is disrupting the front desk and refuses to leave. Grace opened her mouth to protest, but Monica held up a hand. Ma'am, this is a high-end establishment. You're clearly upsetting our guests. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Grace tried to explain once more, this time mentioning her husband and why this place was so important to them. But Monica didn't want to listen. Each attempt Grace made was quickly dismissed, cut off by another cold remark or patronizing smile. Eventually, Monica turned to a nearby young employee, a new staff member named Liam, who had been silently watching the entire scene unfold. "Escort her out, please," she ordered. Liam hesitated. His eyes flicked to Grace, full of uncertainty, but after a tense pause, he nodded slowly, walking over with an apologetic look. "Ma'am," he said gently, avoiding eye contact, "if you would come with me." Grace took one last look around the restaurant where she'd once made a cherished memory. She remembered how the soft glow of chandeliers had once reflected in their wine glasses, how Daniel had nervously held her hand under the table, and how they'd laughed about splitting a dessert because they couldn't afford two. That night had been about dreams and possibilities. This place had been the backdrop to the beginning of their journey. The chandeliers still sparkled, the music still played softly, but the warmth had long vanished. She straightened her back, nodded quietly, and walked toward the exit, dignity intact, even as the stares and whispers followed behind her. Moments later, the quiet hum of an engine disrupted the evening air as a sleek black Porsche pulled up directly in front of the restaurant. Its polished surface gleamed beneath the golden lights of the entrance, attracting subtle glances from onlookers both inside and out. The valet, who had just turned from assisting another guest, paused and straightened his jacket as the car door opened. Out stepped Daniel Thompson, dressed in a tailored midnight blue tuxedo that hugged his tall frame with effortless elegance. Every movement he made was deliberate yet relaxed, the posture of someone who never needed to announce his success. At 42, Daniel exuded the quiet confidence of a man who had built his life not only through innovation but through integrity. He glanced toward the restaurant with a faint smile, holding a small wrapped box in his hand, the anniversary gift he'd hoped to share with Grace after surprising her. He had finished his final meeting of the day early and, remembering that Grace mentioned visiting the Crystal Court, decided to find her and perhaps grab dessert at their favorite bakery afterward. Little did he know, as he stepped onto the sidewalk, that his arrival would mark the turning point of an evening neither of them would forget. When he entered, Daniel's sharp gaze scanned the room with precision, honed by years of leadership and quiet observation. The soft murmur of conversations began to fade as patrons sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Vanessa, still at the hostess stand, looked up, and her confident expression faltered the moment her eyes met his. Her posture stiffened, and the color drained from her face as realization dawned. This was the man whose wife had just been turned away. Daniel's presence was commanding, but not boastful. He carried with him the subtle weight of power, the kind that didn't demand attention, but commanded respect. He walked with purpose toward the front of the restaurant. And just then, Grace stepped through the door behind him, her hand brushing his arm in silent solidarity. Vanessa's voice caught in her throat as she opened her mouth to greet him, but Daniel spoke first, his voice calm yet edged with unmistakable resolve that silenced the room entirely. "You asked my wife to leave because of her clothes, but you never stopped to ask who she was, what she stood for, the impact she makes, or the values she embodies. You saw only a cardigan and jeans, but you missed the compassion, resilience, and strength of someone who dedicates her life to serving others. You dismissed her presence without understanding her purpose, and in doing so, you revealed more about your standards than about hers. The words hung heavy in the air like a thunderclap just before a storm. Whispers died down. Monica appeared again, eyes wide, clearly caught off guard by the developing situation. Grace stood tall beside her husband, a quiet strength radiating from her posture. Every eye in the room was fixed on them, and the facade of refinement that the restaurant had so carefully cultivated began to crumble at its foundation. You asked my wife to leave because of her clothes, but you never stopped to ask who she was. The restaurant fell into a thick, uneasy silence. Forks hovered mid-air, and conversations died on the lips of curious patrons as Monica attempted to reclaim control of the unraveling moment. Her voice, which had earlier carried authority and condescension, now held a nervous tremor as she offered a series of stammered justifications, something about a misunderstanding or a mix-up in protocol. But Grace didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. With quiet conviction, she looked Monica in the eye and spoke with unwavering calm. You were very clear about who you thought deserved to be here. You didn't just imply it, you enforced it, not just through words, but through your actions, your tone, your refusal to listen. You made a choice to treat me as less, and now you're simply trying to rewrite the story because the ending didn't go the way you expected. Her words cut through the room more sharply than any raised voice could have, echoing with truth that no apology could instantly erase. Even when Monica, now visibly flustered, tried to salvage the moment by offering the best table in the house, complete with complimentary champagne and apologies, Daniel remained unmoved. He glanced around the restaurant, at the opulent decor, the watching eyes, and the uncomfortable silence. Then he looked at Grace, her quiet dignity speaking louder than any confrontation could. "We came here to celebrate our values," Daniel said, his voice steady, measured, but layered with deep disappointment. Kindness, humility, respect, shared memories. This was the place where we first imagined our future together, where we dreamed before we had anything. But tonight, that dream was stained by judgment and exclusion. He paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. This place no longer reflects those values. It doesn't represent who we are anymore, and it certainly doesn't deserve to be part of our celebration. He took Grace's hand, and together they turned away. Grace glanced over her shoulder one last time, not out of regret, but to remind herself how far she'd come from seeking approval to standing in her truth. A quiet thought crossed her mind. They tried to make me feel small, but I've never stood taller. Not out of anger, but out of a quiet defiance that echoed far louder than any raised voice. The moment sparked a ripple, subtle at first, but quickly growing into something undeniable. A respected elderly couple, who had been dining at the Crystal Court for over 2 decades, rose from their table with grace and conviction. The woman, elegant in a pearl grey shawl, spoke directly to Monica in a voice that was both gentle and unyielding. This place used to be about memories and meaning. Tonight, you reminded us that appearance has taken precedence over integrity. We won't be returning. Her husband placed a comforting hand on her back as they exited quietly, their departure leaving a heavy silence in their wake. At the same time, the young employee, Liam, who had been tasked with escorting Grace out earlier, could no longer contain the discomfort that had been simmering within him. With his voice trembling but resolute, he removed his server's jacket and placed it carefully on the hostess stand. "I can't work for a place that treats people this way," he said firmly. "This was wrong, every part of it." As they left, others exchanged uncertain glances and a few diners quietly asked for their checks. The once pristine illusion of exclusivity and class had been cracked open, revealing a foundation not of luxury, but of prejudice. Days later, Grace and Daniel chose to celebrate their anniversary at a modest, inclusive restaurant nestled in a vibrant, multicultural neighborhood. The walls were covered in local art, and the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. There were no dress codes, no whispered judgments, only warmth, laughter, and a shared sense of humanity. It was a place where stories were welcomed, not silenced, and where love could be celebrated freely, no matter the outfit or the bank account. Weeks passed, but the lessons lingered, quietly influencing lives beyond the walls of the Crystal Court. Grace returned to the Eastside Community Arts Center in her neighborhood with renewed energy, using the experience not as a wound, but as a catalyst. Her classes expanded, drawing in more students from diverse backgrounds, people who, like her, had felt invisible in spaces that claimed to be refined. She launched new workshops focused not only on pottery, but on self-expression, resilience, and community building. Parents shared how their children found confidence through art, and Grace began mentoring local teachers to replicate her methods in underserved schools. Meanwhile, Liam didn't just walk away from the restaurant industry, he walked toward purpose. With guidance from Grace and support from Daniel, he founded a non-profit arts program dedicated to empowering underprivileged youth. His passion for storytelling through art turned into a citywide initiative, bringing creativity and healing to children who had long been overlooked. The Thompson Foundation didn't just fund his work, they helped him develop sustainable programs, connect with local leaders, and secure spaces for art centers in low-income neighborhoods. Even Vanessa, the hostess whose judgment had triggered that painful evening, began a journey of reflection. A few weeks later, she nervously reached out to Grace and asked to meet for coffee. Grace agreed, curious but open-hearted. At a quiet local cafe, Vanessa apologized in person, her voice trembling with sincerity. She admitted she had been conditioned to judge people by surface appearances and that Grace's quiet strength had challenged everything she thought she knew. Grace listened patiently, then offered not just forgiveness, but encouragement. That moment marked the beginning of a new chapter for Vanessa, one rooted in humility and learning. She sent Grace a heartfelt letter, not only apologizing, but acknowledging the patterns of behavior she had never questioned. In that letter, she shared how the incident had opened her eyes to the kind of person she didn't want to be. She had since resigned from her position and started volunteering at a local shelter where she was learning to see people for who they truly were, not how they dressed or what they could afford. What began as an act of exclusion had, in its unraveling, created a movement of inclusion quiet, steady, and growing with every new act of empathy. True value is not in the appearance. As Grace molded clay in her studio one quiet afternoon, Daniel brought her coffee. Her hands moved with practiced grace, shaping the soft, yielding material into a new form, just as the events of the past weeks had shaped her. Each rotation of the wheel was a quiet reminder. Clay, like people, only finds its true form through pressure, patience, and transformation. And shared the news. The Crystal Court was now under new management, with a sign in the window that read, "All are welcome." Their story reminds us that appearances can mislead, but character always reveals the truth. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us your story in the comments because your voice matters here. Have you ever been judged unfairly by your appearance? What did you learn from it? Join our community as we continue sharing real stories that remind us true worth is never found on the surface, but always in the heart more than it seems. It was a chilly Tuesday morning when Marcus, a middle-aged delivery driver, stopped by a local coffee shop to grab a quick espresso before his shift. The place was small and cozy, tucked into a quiet corner of the city. As he entered, he noticed a young woman sitting alone at a corner table, nervously clutching a portfolio. Her clothes were simple, a bit wrinkled, her shoes worn. The barista behind the counter, dressed in a crisp uniform, gave her a fleeting glance and looked away. No greeting, no warmth. Marcus stepped up to order, then turned to the young woman. "Hey, you okay? You look like you're preparing for something big." She looked up, startled, but smiled. "Interview, I've been out of work for a while, just hoping today's my break." Moved by her honesty, Marcus bought her a drink and a muffin. "On me. Consider it fuel for a fresh start." The barista raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Marcus gave a polite nod and sat nearby. A few minutes later, a sharply dressed man entered, glanced around, and approached the woman. "Miss Riley, I'm from Golden Bridge Media. Ready for our interview?" The barista's eyes widened. The woman straightened, thanked Marcus softly, and left with the recruiter. Moments later, the barista awkwardly approached Marcus and said, "Sorry, I guess I misjudged her." Marcus replied with a gentle shrug. "We all do sometimes, but it costs nothing to treat people with kindness." 2 weeks later, the shop displayed a framed newspaper clipping. "From jobless to creative director, a story of grit and grace." The woman, Riley James, had shared her story and Marcus's simple act of kindness. That morning, the coffee shop served every customer with an extra smile. Moral: sometimes the most ordinary moments become the most meaningful when met with kindness. True worth isn't seen on the outside, it's revealed through how we treat one another. If this story reminded you of a time someone showed you unexpected kindness, share it in the comments. Let's keep the ripple going. Subscribe for more true, touching stories that reflect the best in all of us. Meaningful takeaways from more than it seemed. Life lesson: never judge a person by their appearance. Everyone you meet is fighting a battle you can't see. A small act of kindness can change someone's entire day or even their life. This story highlights the value of unconditional kindness, empathy, and the ability people have to change. It reminds us that everyone deserves respect, no matter how they dress, what they look like, or where they are in life. Success isn't always visible, and sometimes the quietest person in the room is on the edge of something amazing. In today's fast-paced world, where image and status are often put above compassion, this story is a powerful reminder of what truly matters. Marcus's simple gesture speaks volumes. It shows us that kindness doesn't need to be grand to be impactful. I believe if each of us took a little more time to be kind and understanding, the world would be a much softer, better place. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to Toch Story so you never miss another uplifting moment. Each week, we bring you powerful and emotional stories that remind us all of the goodness still alive in the world. Have you ever been judged unfairly or helped someone who was? Share your story in the comments. You never know who might be inspired by your words.